In this lecture, we will discuss behaviors, assessment, and function. Why is it so important that we clearly identify and define a target behavior? Well, how you define a behavior will affect how you measure it, how you design the intervention, and how you evaluate progress. It's a big deal. Let's consider someone who wanted to target exercise for increase and defined it as such. Take 1 walk outside per day. Seems reasonable. But let's consider that I could easily meet this target. But is it actually meaningful? I could just step outside, walk 10 feet, and that would count. With Spider-Man here, perhaps the girl doesn't want to have any contact with Spider-Man. Is "don't call" enough? Couldn't he still text, email, stop by her house, etc.? How we define the behavior will have widespread effect throughout all aspects of an intervention. We can categorize behaviors in many ways. One way is to organize them into overt and covert behaviors. Overt behaviors are what you can observe, define, and measure objectively. Pretty much everything we do. Biting nails, sneezing, reading a book, scratching an itch, yelling at our dog. Covert behaviors are those behaviors that occur, as Skinner called, within the skin. These are internal and much more difficult to define and measure objectively. Examples would include feeling anxious, negative self-talk, happiness. Many of these covert behaviors have related overt behaviors that can be directly measured, such as heart rate, skin conductivity, and hormone secretion. Sometimes a behavior we target is actually a set of responses. We call these behaviors a chain. A chain must be performed in a certain order for it to be completed. Getting dressed would be a good example. Although there are some variations in the order, you will almost always need to put your underwear on first, before your pants, socks before your shoes, and coat after your shirt. Each link in the chain is considered an antecedent response pair. This means that each link has an antecedent component that signals that the next response should occur, and that response then acts as the antecedent for the next response. Let's use getting dressed as an example. You see your underwear, an antecedent, and you put them on, the response. You have your underwear on, antecedent, and so you look for your pants, response. You see your pants, antecedent, and you put them on, response. For complex sets of behavior chains, behavior analysis use a tool called a task analysis. A task analysis breaks down complex sets of behavior into smaller components. Each of these smaller components, links in the chain, can be targeted for teaching or improvement. An example I like to use for task analyses is the making of a sandwich. We often don't give much thought to the process, but this chain has many smaller components. If I were setting out to teach this chain to a person with little to no experience with the behaviors, it might require that I teach every single step here individually. This particular example shows 14 possible steps, but depending on the individual, this task analysis could be broken up into many more discrete skills. Take a moment and think of how many smaller responses are actually involved in each one of these steps here. ABA makes use of teaching alternative responses, especially when targeting behaviors for reduction. You never take away a response from someone's repertoire without giving one back that will be just as useful. Alternative behaviors are ones that will be effective and desirable for the person. Some examples would be teaching someone to ask for help instead of yelling out, or teaching a smoker to meditate instead of smoking a cigarette. Competing behaviors may not be particularly useful, but they are incompatible or interfere with being able to engage in the target behavior. The competing response must be reinforced for it to work. The example of teaching a nail biter to put their hands in their pockets is certainly a competing response. You can't have your nails in your pocket and bite them at the same time. But just as with any behavior, it must be reinforced for it to continue to occur in the future. With young children, it might be enough just to praise, but for others, you may need to find something more potent. Just as we discussed with target behaviors, these competing or alternative behaviors must be clearly and objectively defined and measured. The way that we measure the target behavior will depend on the dimension of the behavior we want changed. Behavior can be measured across several dimensions: how long, or the duration; how often, called frequency or rate; how soon, called latency; and how well, quality or percent correct; and even how strongly it occurs, magnitude or intensity. Depending on the way in which you want or need the behavior to change, you will select one or more of these dimensions to measure the behavior. For the purposes of your self-management project, you will most likely use frequency or duration measures. ABA practitioners use a variety of methods to assess behavior. The broadest ways of categorizing these methods are indirect or direct assessments. Indirect assessments include subjective measures like interviews, self-report, questionnaires, rating scales. These are not particularly reliable, but may be necessary in some cases where it is difficult or impossible to directly observe a behavior. Direct assessments involve observing the actual behavior and taking data on its occurrence. This provides a much more accurate picture of the behavior and the context in which it occurs. In self-management programs, you will assess your own behavior. For overt behaviors, direct assessment is highly recommended. For covert behaviors, the less reliable indirect assessment methods will be necessary. Direct assessment methods are the preferred method as they are objective. The practitioner, or yourself in the case of self-monitoring, will observe and record instances of the behavior as they occur. You will also observe and record the antecedents and consequences that occur close in time with that behavior. Sometimes, formal tests are run to more accurately assess the behavior. In the case of spider fear mentioned in the text, it may be necessary to contrive or set up instances that make the target behavior more likely to occur so that it can be directly observed and measured. Indirect assessments use a roundabout way to measure behavior. These include interview and rating scales. They typically rely on self-report, subjective reports from caregivers and loved ones, and memory, all of which are very unreliable. In some circumstances, physiological measures can be used to measure covert behaviors, such as stress or anxiety. But these are not easily accessible and can be expensive. ABA does use indirect measures, but almost always uses them in conjunction with a direct assessment. There are a variety of ways data can be recorded. Each method has benefits and drawbacks. The method that provides measures most closely aligned to the actual phenomenon being measured is continuous recording. Continuous recording means that you record all instances of behavior in a time period. The longer period of time, the more reliable the measure. However, this can be very difficult to do for behaviors that occur very frequently. Interval recording is another method that can provide a relatively good picture of the behavior. In interval recording, the practitioner records whether or not the behavior did or did not occur in a predetermined interval of time. An example of this would be to take a 30-minute section of time and split it into 30 one-minute intervals. Then you record whether or not you bit your nails during every 1-minute interval. This type of recording method requires some sort of timer or signal so that the recorder knows when the interval starts and stops. The shorter the interval, the more accurate the measurement. Time sampling is similar to interval recording in that you are just looking at a small slice of time. The method you will most likely use for your self-management project will be continuous recording. All behavior serves a purpose, a function. In order to design an effective intervention, we must identify the function, or functions, of a behavior first. There are a few primary functions of all behavior. Tangible, which means to get something. Attention, which means to get someone's attention. Escape or avoid, to get away or to put off the start of something. And automatic, the behavior itself is desirable, such as scratching an itch or chewing gum. Behavior can be maintained by more than one of these variables at once. Many times, babies cry in order to get a bottle. This would be an example of the function of the crying being tangible. That same baby may cry because they want mommy. This would be attention. Still, there may be times where the baby cries because their diaper is wet. This would be escape. The baby finds the wet diaper unpleasant, aversive, and wants to have the unpleasantness removed. So, why do we need to know the function? We must understand the need behind the behavior. Without that, we will not be able to find an appropriate replacement behavior, alternative behavior, nor will we be able to target the appropriate antecedent and consequences that will need to be altered. Consider the case of a student acting out in class. If the teacher assumes it is because they want the attention of peers, for example, that the function of the behavior is attention, the intervention put in place might be timeout. However, a direct assessment of the behavior may demonstrate that the child acts out in class because the work is very difficult and unpleasant, and they don't want to do it. In this case, the function of the behavior is escape. Would removing the child from class be a good choice for a behavior that is maintained by escape? Functional assessment is a procedure for identifying connections between a behavior and its antecedents and consequences. It can be very detailed, formal, and include actual experimental tests to see what the variables involved really are. This is called a functional analysis. Or they can be based on direct observation and interview. If direct observation is not possible, an assessment can be conducted by using indirect measures like interview, checklist, record review, etc., but this type of assessment may not produce reliable information. One of the most common tools used to record data for functional assessment is the ABC log. The ABC in ABC log refers to the three-term contingency we discussed earlier: antecedent, behavior, consequence. Collecting ABC data can reveal patterns in responding. We can start to see what antecedents often come before the behaviors and what consequences often come after. With accurate recording, you can often see patterns in responding after 2 to 5 days, or after recording 10 to 12 instances of behavior. This shows an example of a completed ABC recording. We only describe exactly what can be seen and avoid terms like he was frustrated and hit, or he was bored and he did something. Only objective descriptions are used in this recording. The antecedent column will include details about what was happening directly before the behavior. Could be that the room was loud and the teacher brought out a worksheet. In the behavior column, describes precisely what happened in direct and objective ways. In the consequence column, we describe exactly what happened immediately after the behavior. Did he go to timeout? Did he get extra assistance from the teacher? Did he get to take a break?